everyone. We're happy to have you here. I know we've got a lot of people trickling in the first few minutes, but since we're only here an hour, I'm going to go ahead and get started with our presentation. My name is Jennifer Groth. I am the Director of Policy and Partnership for Rural Development Initiatives, and we'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, which is entitled Getting Dollars to Rural Strategies for Funding Rural Priorities. So looking forward to a good conversation. I just wanted to mention very quickly for those of you who may not have heard of RDI before that our mission, Rural Development Initiatives, mission is to strengthen rural people, places, and economies in the Pacific Northwest. We've been doing it for 30 years, just this December. And if you would like more information, you're welcome to visit our website at rdiinc.org. Also want to thank our sponsors, the Ford Family Foundation, Oregon Humanities, and the Association of Washington Cities for providing the dollars that we need to put these presentations on. Really appreciate the support. So I know that this all at this stage in our virtual life is pretty obvious, but I do want to mention that we are in a learning space. So in terms of being respectful of one another, please try to keep muted when you're not speaking so you can hear our presenters. You're welcome to use the chat feature just to introduce yourself, or for any questions or comments you have about the presentation. We encourage liberal use of the chat for these sessions. And because we have a lot of people signed on to this particular Zoom meeting, if you want, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there is a speaker view option that will make the screen a little bit larger for the person who is speaking. If you do have questions during the session, please feel free to throw them in the chat. We're going to try to get to as many as we can today. So one of the things we want to explain is why we're doing this. After the events of the last couple of years, we saw a need to organize a series of conversations to elevate discussion around important topics that we saw that were cropping up in rural communities in the Pacific Northwest. So far, we have hosted conversations centered around remote work, access to government officials and resources, the rural-urban divide, and also seeing diversity in rural. Today, we're going to focus on the federal and state philanthropic resources to rural communities, because we understand that those are historically and disproportionately low. And unfortunately, that sometimes means that even though we have hard-won consensus on the priorities that we want to pursue as rural communities, that consensus is met with significant resource challenges. So our goal today is to raise awareness of rural needs for grant funding, venture capital, and technical assistance in rural, and the system shifts that are required to make those changes. So let me introduce our panelists really quickly, and then we'll get started. So first, I'd like to introduce Caroline Cummings. She provides strategic leadership for RAIN, which stands for Regional Accelerator and Innovation Network. The organization I just misspoke here. So Caroline guides development, stakeholder relations, and community partnerships for the organization. She oversees the execution of RAIN's rural venture capitalist programs by providing outreach and support to small and rural communities, coaches and mentors regional entrepreneurs, and helps fill ecosystem gaps through strategic partnerships. Suzanne Dale Esty has over 30 years of experience delivering results in economic development, intergovernmental relations, strategic communications, and nonprofit leadership. She is the principal of Dale Esty Partnerships, Strategy and Results, which is a public affairs consulting firm, and among other clients, also serves as the executive director of the Washington Economic Development Association. Lastly, we have Alan Smart, who is a great friend of RDI, as are Suzanne and Caroline. He is a national spokesperson and advocate for improving rural philanthropic practice under his group called Philanthropy Works. He is a longtime rural grant maker and regularly consults with local, regional, and national foundations and nonprofits on rural and philanthropic strategy. So, as I mentioned before, as we go through our conversation today, please feel free to put your questions in the chat window. We do have some planned questions that we're going to ask, but we want to make sure that we get your thoughts and comments in here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take the slide deck down so we can see people a little bit better. Hello, everybody. And so let's go ahead and get started. The first question we want to ask our panel is, what do you think of, when you think about your work in rural places, what are the opportunities that you see for improving access to resources to support community vitality and economy building? And I think I'm just going to pick Caroline. I hope that's okay because she's in the corner of my screen to go ahead and start us off today.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, RDI, for inviting me into this really important conversation. I appreciate everybody showing up today. I know some of the faces. This is a great question. Having supported rural entrepreneurial ecosystem for over a decade off and on, since I've been in Oregon for almost 20 years, I think one of the biggest areas of improvement for getting resources to rural is really engaging and activating the folks who live in rural. So for example, a lot of folks that we assist in rural are told they have to go to the closest, quote, metro area to get help if they're an entrepreneur. So in Oregon, that means Eugene or Corvallis or Bend or Portland. And that's not how you help rural. How you help rural is you catalyze those resources locally. And what's needed to help build an inclusive entrepreneurial economy is you have to activate the people, that is the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the successful business owners, or people who have experience in various areas of business, to be mentors. And you have to access and activate the spaces. Maybe they're empty spaces. Maybe it's the city hall. Maybe it's the Grange. Maybe it's the chambers, whatever it might be. But you have to go to the entrepreneurs where they are. And you have to activate capital, which is a big part of the conversation we're going to be talking about. And I know that we're going to be addressing that more later, so I won't dig deeper into that conversation. But I think the key takeaway here is many of the resources already exist in rural. They just need to be catalyzed.
Great, thanks, Caroline, appreciate that. Alan, would you like to comment on the first question?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, RDI folks, for having me. So it's good to be with you, and great to be with a new crew. I'm usually with a funder heavy audience, so good to see people actually doing the work. That's not always true in the funder community, but yeah, I think just a couple ideas, or the way that I speak to funders about doing better rural work is, what are kind of the promising practices? What are the kind of the innovation spots that might be on a really small scale that people in a rural place might think of as not really having much gravity for a larger audience, but what are the opportunities for funders and rural places to work together and really not necessarily scaling in a way that overtaxes the nonprofit or the rural community, but in a way that really enhances what's going on already, rather than a funder really investing in starting a bunch of new stuff. What's the ability of a funder in a rural community to connect on work that's promising, that's going on already? The second piece I'll mention, rural communities are hard pressed to get the attention of funders, often because they're coming from the perspective, here we are in a rural community of 1,700 or rural county of 5,000. I think the ability of rural people, rural places to join together in partnership, in collaborative models that may resemble success they've had in the past, but maybe haven't been tried recently. It's a very compelling argument for funders to hear that there's an organized way to get penetration into a certain part of a state or a 3 or 4 county region versus the community of 500 by another community of 500. So what's the ability of rural places to take that kind of assets they have in their history of working together in many cases and present that to a funder audience?
Thanks, Alan. I just want to, as long as we've got Alan talking, I just want to make sure we get this question in here really quick. Alan, somebody asked if there are any consolidated databases for people to use to find rural specific funding opportunities. I'm not aware of any, but I didn't know if you knew.
Yeah, I would not say there is one that is broadly multi-issue. I will say the folks at the Rural Health Information Hub on the University of North Dakota have a much wider breadth of rural funding opportunities that they're representing than they would have in 5 years ago when it was very healthcare specific, much more social determinants of health broad. They are heavily on state and federal opportunities, but I'm certainly happy to talk to anyone offline about ways to kind of just source information on rural funding opportunities.
Yeah, and I think we do have a link to that Alan gave, so we'll put that in the chat for you, Sarah. Suzanne, I want to give you an opportunity to sort of talk about opportunities that you see to improve access to resources in your work.
Thank you. And I really appreciate being part of this conversation today. It's really, really important. I'll admit at the outset, Suzanne from Seattle with a pretty urban perspective, but I've now been the executive director of WIDA for 3 years, and I've been on the board prior, and have just through COVID developed a much deeper understanding of how our rural communities are indeed part of those underserved populations. And it's a very, very serious challenge. In fact, I would say that this is the central challenge we have for what we're fighting for at WIDA, which is a more inclusive economic recovery. First, I want to agree with Caroline that what we've got to do is leverage our existing resources. I think, of course, and we're hearing this often, but one of the silver linings of this horrific pandemic, now up to 800 million deaths. Is that right? 800 million deaths? 800,000 deaths. Thank you. Close to a million. Just stunning, no matter how you slice it. One of the silver linings is that when we've had this crisis that's created the opportunity of circling our wagons to do this triage of scrambling to getting resources out to our small businesses and underserved. A lot of the turf politics between organizations have been set aside, and folks have really coalesced at the regional level and in Washington, and I think elsewhere at the state level. And I think that's been really powerful. We've got to figure out how to sustain that. I will say, though, as we're starting to drill in and better understand the gaps in our ecosystem in Washington state, we're seeing that there's just parts of our state that don't have those regional networks. So what we've got to do, and obviously I'm biased running a statewide trade association that tries to be a voice for economic developers. What we've got to do is strengthen that voice. We've got to demonstrate that this is a crisis, that we've got to have broadband access so that organizations can leverage these virtual opportunities like this today to learn from each other. But also we've got to exercise a more aggressive, strong voice that there are gaps in the system. We need more capacity building. We need more resources for our rural communities.
Thanks, Suzanne. So Suzanne already touched upon this a little bit, but I wanted to ask our other two panelists. We had a question in the chat. Somebody asked, now that employees aren't, tethered to desks, and there seems to be somewhat of a move to migrate out of urban areas to more rural spaces, are you seeing any change to resources as a result of that? Do you think that people like philanthropic funders or federal or state agencies are responding to that by diverting more resources, or is it too early to say?
I can chime in on that. For the work that we do at RAIN, helping entrepreneurs start or launch their businesses, what we have found since we pivoted to all programming being virtual, as many of us I'm sure on this call have, we have engaged more rural folks because they maybe, they're home, they're able to join various educational programs, and as a result realize that everyone has something to give to a rural entrepreneur. And that is a concept previously that people kind of thought, oh, you have to be this big venture capitalist from the Silicon Valley to help an entrepreneur. And that is not true. Every single person has something that they can give. So we have seen a lot more participation from the non-entrepreneurial population in the rural communities who are joining to get educated and also mentor the people in their own backyard.
Great. Alan, have you seen any shifts?
Yeah, I was thinking off the top of my head, in the last couple of months, I've spoken to funders in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Idaho, and Montana about this issue of people from urban communities or sometimes who had second homes, but now making these rural communities their primary home. and how to connect them with organized philanthropy in a way, or how nonprofits can connect and educate, and what's the trajectory of kind of when just being present in a community ends up being, some significant increase in philanthropic resource. So story too young to be told. I don't know. I don't have a whole menu of success stories, but tremendous opportunity and challenge where there's been this kind of very intentional and rapid migration in many states from urban to rural.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. We'll have to see. I think it's still playing out would be, I think, what we're hearing. But there's certainly probably some opportunities there. Let me just pivot for a minute. Suzanne, I want to ask you a specific question about something that's near and dear to RDI's heart, which is when we do get resources to rural in terms of dollars, we like to advocate for the fact that it needs to be coupled with some kind of technical assistance. So I'm wondering, I know that you've had a lot of success with this in Washington State. So I want to know if you could address, what role does technical assistance play in increasing the success of rural projects and small businesses once they do receive funding?
You'd think we could figure out the mute button by now. Well, I really appreciate the question. I'm a huge believer, just to set the table, that technical assistance should have a broad definition. And we need to set aside the sort of elitism of technical assistance and build a really big tent. We have been successful with this in Washington State. Technical assistance includes city economic development managers who help small businesses with A-frames or permits. And then on that continuum, what's crucial, obviously, on the far end is the real experts in financing who can help a small business seal a deal with a loan. We have been successful in Washington State at strengthening the technical assistance ecosystem. And quite frankly, again, through COVID, having organizations figure out who each other are at a really fundamental level. We have these economic development councils. So WIDA has all of the 34 EDCs in our membership. And frankly, some of those folks didn't know who their CDFIs were or really what a CDFI was. They didn't necessarily know. And I'm still learning about organizations like RAIN. How can we increase access to capital in our own communities? So we've had, just briefly, what we call a Washington Small Business Resources Mobilization Campaign. And this year we were able to secure over $400,000 in philanthropic funding just to mobilize resources and get these technical assistance organizations working side by side to get resources to rural, to underserved communities, to get translated materials out to organizations. And I think it's crucial. As I said earlier, we're also identifying that there's huge gaps. So what we're doing now is exercising that voice and trying to pursue more resources, taking this moment when there isn't as much cash on the table for individual businesses and trying to capitalize on some of the federal dollars that are on the table to strengthen our ecosystem for the long haul.
Great insights, and congratulations on your success. Alan, I'm wondering, as we talk about technical assistance, one of the things that we also see in rural quite frequently is, that people can know that these grant opportunities exist, but that they don't necessarily feel comfortable that they have the skills to actually write a grant. And I'm wondering to what extent you see that in your work, and if you think there are opportunities to make changes or add resources to just that type of technical assistance.
I think there was actually some good examples coming out of COVID where funders who had relatively modest investment, whether from a human resource or financial capital perspective, in their rural communities, might have an urban hub, but underserved rural places that were part of their geography, who invested in the kind of program development, grant writing services that you're referencing. What foundations haven't been great about is actually providing rural communities with kind of a stable resource for that precedes RFP opportunities or a big bucket of federal or state money. It's often responsive to a particular opportunity rather than laying the groundwork for a community to be prepared for half a dozen or a dozen kind of opportunities that might come down the pike over a year or two. So I think certainly as nonprofits talk to funders about capacity building needs, this idea of hiring the grant writer needs to be put much more in the context for something that's longer term, and is also relates to kind of program development, multi-issue program development rather than episodic response to funding availability.
Yeah, that's a great insight in terms of the work that we do being sort of having a long time horizon for sure. So Caroline, I'm also wondering, I know you are certainly a person that is probably way on board with the concept of technical assistance and providing expertise and support, and that's probably what your organization is, really knee deep in. And I'm wondering if you have any additional comments about the idea of pairing that with the resources as they come to the community.
Yeah, and what Susan said too about technical assistance needing to be defined broadly or differently because it means something different. If you talk to a city councilor or a county commissioner or an entrepreneur or someone you just meet in the grocery store, it's also just a term that has an elitist feel to it with the word technical in it, right? And I think the biggest thing that I would add about technical assistance, and this is what's always interesting when we're applying to grants, they're saying, fill out this grant for technical assistance for X. And we're like, well, actually, we have this listen, respond model. That's not needed. This is what's needed. The model needs to be investigative, not prescriptive. So what I would prefer, if there were opportunities for funding that said, tell us what technical assistance means to you and what is needed that you have found, and show the data to support that that's what's needed. And then funding opportunities should be wrapped around those needs, as opposed to usually it's the other way around. Not for everyone, certainly, but I think that's probably the biggest thing. And in particular, through this pandemic, the technical assistance, and for us, what technical assistance means, surveying entrepreneurs, and they need access with, how do I get online and do digital sales and marketing? Should I be using the new latest and greatest tools for selling online? How do I raise capital? What do I do? What are the steps to do that? How do I understand what a balance sheet or a P&L, or believe it or not, there's a lot of business owners out there who are running $1 million corporations who don't know how to read a balance sheet or a P&L. And they missed out on a lot of that emergency funding that came out of the federal government, the EIDL and the PPP. So I would really like to see more transition to, wouldn't it be beautiful to do like a massive asset map of rural America to find out what the needs are, everybody compile them together, and then present that. We sort of reverse pitch it back to funders to say, these are the top 3 or 5 things that are needed in rural America. Who wants to step up and fund it?
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea. That's a great concept. So we have a couple questions in the chat I want to field really quickly. And I'm not sure if I understand this one, but I'll throw it out there and maybe one of our panelists wants to grab it. It says there seems to be, so there's a perception that there are strings attached to funding for small businesses that would make rural businesses disinclined to apply. And the example they provide are EDC funds. How can we prevent the fine print that is created for urban from hurting rural? So I'm not exactly sure of the specific example, but wondering if anybody has a comment about that.
I guess I would just simply chime in that I think that is a very real problem. I think it's a problem that impacts not just rural communities, communities of color, and just to state the obvious, these grant applications and loan applications need to be simplified, and people need support in completing them. A lot of them are really complicated, and to Caroline's point, do need true technical assistance in order to support them. But I'd say at that fundamental level, the policymakers the staff members of governmental agencies and philanthropic organizations that are pushing out these applications need to be counseled, and we all need to engage and speak up and ask for simplicity and less bias so that the playing field can be level.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Any other comments on that? Well, let's move on then to a question for Alan. So based on your work, are there any changes to the grant making processes that you haven't already mentioned that you would recommend to foundations that are trying to fund in rural, that they're adapting to the unique needs of their populations, or other types of underrepresented populations in rural, like the Latino or BIPOC or Indigenous communities?
Yeah, the three I jotted down, which I think would be pervasive and ever present and not solvable tomorrow, but certainly something that funders, I think, are working on and always need to hear more about, is kind of the perspective on what success looks like. Success in a rural place from a funder perspective needs to be measured and will ultimately look very, very different than in an urban community. And some of that is literally the numbers, the scale of things. So the whole argument of, well, why would we invest in something working with 500 people when we could do it with 5,000 people, and in fact it might be easier. And the counter argument is, well, those 500 people are 80% of the people live in that community versus 5,000 out of 5 million perhaps. So kind of just change the paradigm of how foundations measure what they do and what successful grant making looks like. The second thing is, which we all face every day, the shortage of really accurate and useful data. So funders who are so data heavy in terms of how they make decisions or how they inform strategy, it's just it's a no-win situation for rural places, given the shortage of quality data. I mean, we already see coming out of 2020 census the undercount of emerging immigrant communities and on from there is pretty profound. Funders need to take into account that whatever is being presented is certainly not telling the story in the same way it would in a 4-neighborhood configuration in Chicago, where the data might be both dense and informative. And then, the third piece I wrote down is funders who are very, very issue specific, and that could be health, education, economic development, parks and rec, transportation, food systems, on and on and on, are absolutely missing the way that rural places work together, and leadership roles that are around multiple issues, and government, the convergence of government, nonprofit, and often faith community systems. And the ability of a funder to understand that, but also the ability of rural communities to present that in a way that really does tell that story is still, I guess, under development. It's not well defined. If you're a occasional K through 12 education funder and you don't understand the dynamics of regional, rural high schools and the ways that they are so different, and student access to services and those kinds of things, you can't be effective. So we're always trying to hammer home the idea that the lens from the funder perspective just needs to be different, but the nonprofit and rural side have to realize the funder community often is that naive about how things work, and you've got to paint the picture in a pretty illustrative manner.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I do want to slide in a little shout out to the Ford Family Foundation, who works in rural Oregon and Siskiyou County, California. They have been working on something called the Rural Voices Project, where they're trying to disaggregate data by rural, and we're excited to see the results of that work. Caroline or Suzanne, I wanted to give you the opportunity, because I know you also do a lot of grant writing and grant administration as well, to think about that. the question about any changes to grant making processes that you think would be helpful to the smaller communities where you work. And if you don't have anything to add, it's
Yeah.
fine.
I'll chime in. I think one of the things that's been wonderful that a lot of the funders have done, and not just foundations, but also cities, counties, the state, and federal, is during this pandemic have opened up to say you can apply for funding for just general operations or just capacity building or whatever, and nothing quite so specific, right? Because I don't know about all of you, but what we're doing in six months later, it changes. And then 3 months later, it changes again. And it's like, oh no, do we have to go back to the funder and tell them that that's no longer the problem, it's now this problem? And then the time it takes to revise the grant narrative in the budget and everything. So having the freedom to say, you know, of course, there still has to be rails, right? You're still ultimately doing whatever your mission and your vision is, but having more flexibility in the grant writing process would be wonderful. And then I also, you know, letters of support are really powerful and I think important. And I would love to know from funders who they want letters of support from, right? Because oftentimes, like we would submit letters to the USDA of support, and they were from, you know, the city managers or the mayor or a county commissioner, and they're like, we want to hear a letter of support from an entrepreneur. So we shifted to all of the letters of support come from the entrepreneurs, even though it's the cities and the counties and the state funding the work, right? So I think in these times, as an entrepreneur myself, anytime there's a disruption in the market, it's an opportunity for everybody anywhere to take a look at your business model and what you're doing. I mean, it's a normal process entrepreneurs do. So it would be great to have funders do that as well. And I do think in Oregon, you know, Ford Family did that, Oregon Community Foundation did that, Collins Foundation did that. So I give them all kudos to doing that so that it reduced the barrier for small communities to actually write grants because they don't have the resources, and then we end up writing it for them.
Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Jennifer, I just wanted to add real quick that applications that foster partnerships, I think, and building on, again, what I've talked about as far as strengths-based team efforts, where perhaps a traditional economic development organization is partnering with a community-based organization that has the trusted partner approach, language capabilities. So applications that foster those strength-based relationships. The Community Navigator grant application that the Small Business Administration just had, and frankly, they didn't have enough funding, but I think that approach, both for the applicant side and the funder side, the more we can foster that, I think it will provide for a more efficient system and a system that better serves the customers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great, thank you. I know Alan has one more thing he wanted to say on this topic, and then we have a couple of folks in attendance who wanted to ask questions, so I'll get to them next. So Alan, go ahead. What did you want to add?
I just wanted to add, you know, with the kind of umbrella question of how funder practice might improve to better serve rural. The whole notion that certainly a big cohort of funders still hold that they really all they're interested in is best practice work or evidence-based work. There's very little to no best practice as it's defined in the philanthropic community that's been tested over time in rural places. So you're asking people to do something that's literally impossible. There is not a big database of all proven effective evidence-based best practice, whatever the issue. There's certainly incredible amounts of promising practice, but the funder definition of what is proven is just wrong in many cases. In other cases, just naive. There's a website, kind of an aggregator of best practice and some health and human service issues. They have 60 or 70 evidence-based best practices that funders have often adopted as a funding strategy. I think 4 or 5 I could determine had ever been tried or tested in rural places. So it's once again, it's kind of if you're a funder who is interested in rural work, it's a self-defeating barrier you're putting up to actually accomplish some of the things you're trying to do.
Well said. Thank you, Evelyn. So Clint, I don't know if your comment got in the chat or if you wanted to ask a question.
Well, actually, I didn't want to, I don't have a question. I just had some comments, but I just want to, I'll start on just one of them when it comes to, resources in rural communities. And I know we should leverage them, but I think one of the things that holds businesses back is that, and I work for the Small Business Development Center out of Truckee, the Sierra Small Business Development Center and the SBA. And for new entrepreneurs, you have to have been in business for 2 years before you can get a loan, from almost any bank. And it doesn't matter if you're rural or urban, but that's a big obstacle for a lot of people. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I cover Plumas and Modoc and Lassen counties in Northeast California. And we're all about micro businesses. And those are the small businesses with 5 employees or less, including 1 or 2 owners. Their needs, their genetic makeup is totally different than most small businesses. And I don't think we address their needs or their makeup at all. And I think that's really a challenge, for rural communities, because we have so many moms and pops that they don't have, cash flow statements and P&Ls and, they barely have a general ledger. They're just used to running their business on their gut or on their bank statement and things like that. And they're fiercely independent. They're used to doing things on their own. And so I don't think we help them enough because they're just kind of small and they're, they don't have a lot of big numbers. But I think that's something that's really, really needed. And to penetrate rural areas, since the pandemic, we've lost, in the Great Recession, we've lost radio stations, newspapers. There's not a good way to get our message. I mean, anymore in the communities I serve, if the chambers didn't have an electronic chamber newsletter, there'd be no communication at all in the community. So how do we tell people about the resources that we have, even on the local level? It's really a challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. I appreciate your insights very much. It's great to hear from people on the ground. Actually, it's a great pivot to a question I wanted to ask Caroline. So I'm going to go ahead and pivot to that now. So Caroline, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, you have some really interesting models that you've experienced as part of your organization and maybe as part of your work in general that you've seen related to raising capital for rural entrepreneurs and probably particularly to Clint's point about micro entrepreneurs. And I wonder if you could talk about that and talk about what percentage of venture capital does make it to rural America.
Yeah, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. So Clint, thanks for setting this up. This was a perfect segue. I actually want to ask all of you to just put a number in the chat of what percentage do you think of venture capital makes it to rural America? Just, you don't have to put the percentage, just throw the number in there. 5, 2, 0.2, 7, 10, 5.
It's all in single digits.
Yes, it is. And a few of you hit it. It's 1%. It's actually less than 1%. And as someone who myself was trying to raise capital 12 years ago when I started my first tech company in Eugene, that company ended up failing. The second company, I was able to raise $1 million, but it was so difficult to do. And I'm a white educated female in a metro area. So imagine if you're rural or you're a woman, you're a person of color, you're a veteran, you're a person with disabilities, English is your second language. Now the barriers to accessing capital is even higher. So one of the things we've done at RAIN is we constantly are monitoring the gaps in the entrepreneurial ecosystems in rural. And we all know, if you ask everybody, what do you need? They say money, 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 right? And it's like, okay, we need a few things before you need the money. However, we pitched a bold idea to the federal government, to the EDA, to launch a crowdfunding platform that would allow Oregonians to invest in Oregonians. And actually anybody in the country will be able to invest in Oregon startups and small businesses. And they can be those, most of them will be those micro enterprises with fewer than 5 employees. And through surveys we've done that also aligns with national data, 83% of the entrepreneurs we serve do not qualify for loans for the many reasons we just heard, and some of the ones Clint just mentioned, and nor do they qualify for angel or venture funding. So now you have a huge swath of really awesome entrepreneurs living in small and rural communities who can't raise between the average of what they're looking for is 50,000 to 250,000. So we're not talking about tremendous amounts of capital here. So the EDA funded $1 million project we proposed to them to launch this crowdfunding platform. So we're partnering with Republic. They're out of New York City. They just raised about 200 million in funding. They're a startup themselves. They're the experts in the crowdfunding platform. As a 501c3, we are not allowed to say who gets funded anyway, but we're wrapping technical assistance around these entrepreneurs. And there is a link that I think Freya can put in there if folks want to learn more about how to be an investor. You used to have to be an accredited investor in the eyes of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which meant that you had to have a net worth of at least $1 million, which cannot include the value of your primary residence, or earn 200 or 300,000 a year on your own. Well, thanks to the Jobs Act, now anyone can invest as little as $50 in startups and small businesses in your own backyard. And that's what we're launching. It's called RainCap, and that's the platform. Our vision is to roll this out with Republic across the country. We are now a global nonprofit, and we want to be able to reduce barriers to raising capital. And we meet folks in rural who want to invest $500, $100, $2,000 in the local food cart, or someone starting a cleaning business, or someone doing a tech company. It can be anything and in between. And now they'll be able to do that. So I think this is going to be disruptive. It's going to transform the economy for rural and for small businesses. Anybody who's underrepresented, you can be underrepresented living in Portland or New York City and still not be able to access a bank loan or venture financing. So that's what we're doing to fill that gap. And we can't do it alone. We need every single person here to participate as investors, and all the small businesses who can't get those sources of funding to know who to reach out to, all of you, to say, we can't get this funding. How can we do it so we can create jobs in our backyard?
Great, thanks, Caroline. I saw that there were some other models or opportunities in the chat in terms of capital funding for small business. So thanks for putting that in the chat. I appreciate all of the good sharing of information. Alan and Suzanne, I know, Alan, this may be a little far afield for you because I'm imagining you don't get much involved in venture capital, I'm presuming, so you can tell me if I'm wrong. But I'm wondering if either you have seen models that work for the smaller size and micro businesses that we see in rural communities.
Well, I was going to mention what Andy plugged in the chat, which is the local investment networks. And I also wanted to thank Caroline just for your engagement and innovative approach having, been in the startup world and now having a rural lens, I think is really powerful. So I'm really optimistic about that approach. But I think, and TwistWorks is on in the meeting. That's one example in Washington State of a local investment network where they're rallying, local community to invest in their own. An obvious parallel to that, not focused on capital, but is, since it hasn't been mentioned, is just really emphasizing and educating at a really fundamental level the importance of shopping small and shopping local too. So I just wanted to make sure that was thrown out there. And Clint, I just wanted to thank you again for bringing up the point. We are working in Washington State very closely with the Washington State Micro Enterprise Association, and we do a joint TA Tuesday every Tuesday where they lead a session once a month with the broader economic development community. And I think it's raising awareness about the scale of our micro enterprises and how important they are to our communities. And Alan, I think you were going to speak at the top, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have much to add from a technical perspective, but it's something I talk about frequently, and certainly mirrors my experience in living in very rural Louisiana for a decade. There are obviously people of tremendous wealth in every rural place, even in the poorest rural places. And I think the kind of entrepreneurial support, business startup is often, very appealing to a lot of this kind of people who perceive themselves as self-made wealth. And so I think the ability to tell that story, and a community foundation, for example, to connect those kinds of donors with these entrepreneurial efforts and entrepreneurial kind of structures that they can support, is time is now.
Yeah, well said. I'm glad you brought up community foundations. It's a great vehicle. And I see Heidi, our executive director, has also mentioned that in the chat. So I know we have a couple questions in the crowd, so let me make sure I get those. Vicki, I know you've had your hand up for a while. I want to make sure you have a chance to ask your question if it hasn't already been answered.
I think I actually had it sent to you, but I can just really briefly ask about this. It's kind of a weird thing, but and I don't know if this is something that already exists or what, but in order to get rural grants maybe viewed and not so easily set aside, it'd be nice if there was something along the lines of almost like a good housekeeping seal of approval on those grants, that maybe, you know, a local community would write that grant, send it through some kind of a larger organization, you know, that helps with grant writing, so that it would get reviewed or whatever, and then sent on to whoever you were wanting that, you know, looking for the dollars from. And just so that it would, I mean, just some way to get maybe more attention on the rural grants that are going in, instead of them just being sort of, oh, it's from, you know, this little town, it's from that little town. And, you know, it feels like it's easy for us to get overlooked. And and I don't know that if there's something like that that already exists, or even if it's a possibility or whatever, but it sure would be lovely to have something in place that made it easier for grant writers in rural communities to find a way to be more easily recognized as viable grant applications, legitimate, well thought out, well done, and all of that before it ever hit a grantor's desk.
I see.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting concept. And I know at RDI, there shades of that. We also look for opportunities to sort of aggregate community proposals. So, you know, if there's like 5 communities that want to do the same thing, can we put it all into one proposal for a large foundation? And so that's sort of shades of what you're talking about as well. Do our panelists have any reaction to Vicki's concept or heard anything along those lines?
I was just thinking, oh, go ahead, Alan.
I was gonna say, I've never heard that idea floated. I'm really intrigued by it, and I think there's a there, as they say.
Yeah.
I don't know where to go with it. I'd love to, yeah, love to talk to you all offline if you're interested in further the discussion. But there's something structural there that would have appeal to certain kinds of funders, not maybe wholesale, but on kind of a retail level.
And I was just going to say, I was thinking during the comment that all of that would require more time and more capacity to back off of the deadline date from the application to have that extra touch point. So we've got to leverage systems and leverage resources and build capacity so that applicants have that time, if indeed that opportunity was made available.
Yeah.
Suzanne, it's Vicki again, just really quickly. I guess I'm thinking of it in terms of, you know, maybe not when you're asking for, you know, $500 for, you know, a new drinking fountain on the street or whatever, but maybe more the larger community structured grants for capital improvement projects, et cetera, that would really benefit a community. So maybe there would be a cap on that. In terms of, you know, only applications of, you know, $500,000 or $350,000 or whatever would fit into that evaluation, just to really benefit the communities, the rural communities that are really trying to structure, and not so much just, you know, we want $50 for this or $300 for that.
No, it's really interesting, Vicki.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I want to make sure we get Andy's question in, and I know an hour is never long enough to talk about these things, so I appreciate everybody's good comments, and I hope that you're making some connections here and getting some links to things that are going to be helpful to you going forward. Why don't we go ahead and take your question or comment next, and then we'll start to wrap up.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. I just wanted to go back and speak a little bit more about the local investment network option. Suzanne mentioned it. The Association of Washington Cities has been working for about 8 to 10 years now to try and sort of help template and produce sort of a field guide kit to local investment network development in Washington State. TwistWorks was mentioned. They're an outstanding example. The other one that folks might take a look at is the Lion Network in Port Townsend, which has been around for about 8+ years now. They have successfully utilized about $8 million in local funds to help local businesses in that community and in greater Jefferson County. And there's a few other examples in Washington State as well. But if anybody wants more information, you can reach out to me. Lisa Smith, also with the Washington State Micro Enterprise Association. We've been partnering with them for over a year now to try and get the word out about this option for local entrepreneurs. So anyway, just wanted to add that to the mix.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate it. So let me just ask sort of a wrap-up question of our panelists, and then if we have time for some other comments, we'll get them in there too. So I just want to give all of our panelists who have kindly donated their time to help us out today an opportunity to make some final comments or insights. And one of the things I want to talk about is we are going to be doing sort of a deeper dive into some of the federal funding opportunities that are available under the American Rescue Plan Act, the new Infrastructure Act that just planned, that just passed, pardon me, and then also the Build Back Better legislation that's currently making its way through Congress. And I just want to know if you have any comments about what the best way is for rural nonprofits, business support organizations, local governments to maximize and leverage all of this federal assistance that we think is going to become available based on some of the opportunities and challenges that we've talked about today. I guess maybe I'll pick on Suzanne first, if she doesn't mind making her comments first.
You bet. Well, we've gone through this triage phase, and I do think we need to think about mind shifts from grants toward fully leveraging the federal opportunities you've talked about, Jennifer. We do a lot of work with Bruce Katz, who many of you are familiar with. He does have a bit of an urban bent, but every time he speaks, we ask him to emphasize rural as well. And I think much of his messaging is very relevant to this conversation. Bruce now runs the NOAC Institute at Drexel University. And I would say, and this has come up in our conversation today, but one of the most crucial things folks need to be thinking about, particularly on the ARPA funds, but also something that hasn't been mentioned yet, I don't believe, is the state small business credit initiative. So that's $10 billion coming in the coming months from the US Treasury to communities. And we've got to make sure that rural communities get a huge piece of that. Bruce's guidance is that we've got to strengthen and build the capital delivery systems across our geographies. That his whole point, and I don't 100% agree with it, is it's not about capital, it's about delivery systems. So, kind of consistent with the themes we've had here is let's figure out how we can work together, leverage partnerships, identify the gaps where there aren't the networks that Caroline talked about at the top, and make sure we have the delivery systems to get that capital and get it out to the door, even to these teeny tiny businesses that Clint shine light on. And then, I think just deliberately focusing on reaching the underserved communities, of course, including rural and our communities of color, our tribal populations. I think it's an unfair assumption that our rural communities aren't diverse. So what are we doing to leverage the community-based organizations to make sure that all of our underserved communities are getting these incoming revenue streams that certainly aren't over. There's a lot of cash on the table in Washington State, huge unspent reserves, federal dollars that have come in through infrastructure, unspent federal dollars. We've got several requests out, and you can check out our legislative agenda for the next session on our website.
Thanks, Suzanne. I appreciate the insights. Caroline or Alan, do you want to comment on?
Yeah.
Comments?
I'd love to build off of what Suzanne just said. I think the partnership piece is key. I believe that the data already exists for what to do with the money. If the cities, counties, whoever's getting these funds reached out to the technical assistance providers in their organizations, and I'm not just talking about entrepreneurship, but youth programs and infrastructure and housing, right? a lot of these organizations like us who serve entrepreneurs, we've been surveying the entrepreneurial population, the mentors, the investors for the last 2 years, especially during this pandemic. We have a lot of the data, right? And so that data could be aggregated and shared with specific funders who have the larger pots of money in a region and say, these are the top 6 things that this ARPA money should be spent on. And here's the data to back it up. And now you've included multiple organizations in a region, as opposed to one entity trying to make the decision on what to do with the millions and millions of dollars, right? Especially small communities who are getting significant funds and they have to spend it in a certain amount of time. So they're going to fix their roads and they're going to do what they normally do, right? So I definitely think it's time. Suzanne, I think you said it, we need a mental model shift. This is an incredible opportunity to stop and think and pull in really smart people from various backgrounds, not asking the same people all the time because we're going to get the same answers, and find out what is the best way to invest those funds, and then hold ourselves accountable to delivering on the data as we're implementing whatever it is that we said we would do. I think that would transform not just small and rural communities, but I think it would transform how communities interact with the people who live in them.
Well said. Thank you very much. So Alan, you want to finish us up today?
Yeah, probably, certainly from a different seat or a different perspective, but just two thoughts. One, rural communities that have a depth of knowledge about who really lives there, in terms of economic strata, emerging rural communities of color. That's a very appealing kind of data set, or even if it's informally collected, but very few people know, other than people who live there, what a rural community of color that's changed demographics over the past decade really looks like, what the needs are. So you're the best spokespeople for that, and I think it's a very intriguing kind of funder opportunity that people would love to engage in. And the second, don't be shy about approaching or starting an ongoing dialogue with funders who have this urban footprint. They may be in a city of 200,000, but at least on paper, they have a geography of 17 rural counties connected with them. And certainly in the Health Conversion Foundation world, there's hundreds of foundations that fit that description. So very rural and very urban concurrently do less rural work than they should, and often less rural work than they would want to. So take the fact they have publicly declared themselves, and often from an attorney general ruling, to be serving your rural places. If you're not seeing the resources, I think you're actually in a leverage position to initiate conversation.
Well said. No, that's good. That's a good advice. I appreciate it, Alan. So just to wrap us up here, I do want to mention, as I said earlier, we're going to have a few more webinars, lunch hour webinars in this vein. Our next one is going to be on January 12th. And we're going to feature some of the government affairs folks from the Association of Washington Cities and League of Oregon Cities to talk about community-specific federal funding sources. So we'll put that in the chat for you if you'd like to register. And then I definitely want to give a big shout out to our 3 panelists, Caroline, Suzanne, and Alan, for the valuable information they've provided today. Also, I know we have a few board members from RDI on the call, and also a few of our funders. So I want to make sure and thank the Ford Family Foundation, Oregon Humanities, and AWC for their sponsorship of this series. And we have recorded the session, and we'll send the links to the session and to some of the links that have been in the chat to you. So I hope you all have a great day, and thanks for joining us.
Happy holidays. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you. Happy holidays. Thank you, RDI.